This is part 6 of chapter 4. We are in The Rape of the Mind by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. In Menticide, we are faced with a ritual like that found in witch hunting during the Middle Ages, except that today the ritual has taken a more refined form. Accuser and accused, each affords the other assistance, and both belong together as collaborating members of a ritual of confession and self-denigration. Through their cooperation, they attack the minds of bystanders who identify with them and who consequently feel guilty, weak, and submissive. The Moscow purge trials made many Russians feel guilty. Listening to the confessions, they must have said to themselves, "I could have done the same thing. I could have been in that man's place." When their heroes became traitors, their own hidden treasonable wishes made them feel weak and frightened. This explanation may seem overly complicated and involved, and perhaps even self-contradictory, but, in fact, it helps us to understand what happens in cases of menticide. Both torturer and tortured are the victims of their own unconscious guilt. The torturer projects his guilt onto some outside scapegoat and tries to expiate it by attacking his victim. The victim, too, has a sense of guilt, which arises from deeply repressed childhood hostilities. Under normal circumstances, this sense is kept under control, but in the menticidal atmosphere of relentless interrogation and inquisition, his repressed hostilities are aroused and loom up as frightening phantasmagorias from a forgotten past, which the victim senses but cannot grasp or understand. It is easier to confess to the accusation of treason and sabotage than to accept the frightening sense of criminality with which his long-forgotten aggressive impulses now burden him. The victim's overt self-accusation serves as a trick to annihilate the inner accuser and the persecuting inquisitor. The more I accuse myself, the less reason there is for the inquisitor's existence. The victim's going to the gallows kills, as it were, the inquisitor too, because there existed a mutual identification. The accuser is made impotent the moment the victim begins to accuse himself, and tomorrow the accuser himself may be accused and brought to the gallows. Out of our understanding of this strange masochistic pact between accuser and accused comes a rather simple answer to the questions. Why do people want to control the minds of others, and why do the others confess and yield? It is because there is no essential difference between victim and inquisitor. They are alike. Neither under these circumstances has any control over his deeply hidden criminal and hostile thoughts and feelings. It is obviously easier to be the inquisitor than the victim, not only because the inquisitor may be temporarily safe from mental and physical destruction, but also because it is simpler to punish others for what we feel as criminal in ourselves than it is to face up to our own hidden sense of guilt. Committing menticide is the lesser crime of aggression, which covers up the deeper crime of the unresolved hidden hatred and destruction. A survey of psychological processes involved in brainwashing and menticide. At the end of this chapter, describing the various influences that lead to yielding and surrender to the enemy's strategy, it is useful to give a short survey of the psychological processes involved. Phase 1, artificial breakdown and deconditioning. The inquisitor tries to weaken the ego of his prisoner. Though originally physical torture was used, hunger and cold are still very effective. Physical torture may often increase a person's stubbornness. Torture is intended to a much greater extent to act as a threat to the bystanders, the people's imagination. Their wild anticipation of torture leads more easily to their breakdown when the enemy has need of their weakness. Of course, occasionally a sadistic enemy may find individual pleasure in torture. The many devices the enemy makes use of include intimidating suggestion, dramatic persuasion, mass suggestion, humiliation, embarrassment, loneliness, and isolation, continued interrogation overburdening the unsteady mind, arousing more and more self-pity, patience and time help the inquisitor to soften a stubborn soul. Just as in many old religions the victims were humbled and humiliated in order to prepare for the new religion, so in this case they are prepared to accept the totalitarian ideology. In this phase, out of mere intellectual opportunism, the victim may consciously give in. Phase 2. Submission to and positive identification with the enemy. As has already been mentioned, the moment of surrender may often arrive suddenly. It is as if the stubborn negative suggestibilities changed critically into a surrender and affirmation. What the inquisitor calls the sudden inner illumination and conversion is a total reversal of inner strategy in the victim. From this time on, in psychoanalytic terms, a parasitic superego lives in man's conscience, and he will speak his new master's voice. In my experience, such sudden surrender often occurred together with hysterical outbursts into crying and laughing, like a baby surrendering after obstinate temper tantrums. The inquisitor can attain this phase more easily by assuming a parental attitude. As a matter of fact, many a POW was courted by a form of paternal kindness, gifts, sweets at birthdays, and the promise of more cheerful things to come. Maloney compares this sudden yielding with the theophany or kenosis, internal conversion, as described by some theological rites. For our understanding, it is important to stress that yielding is an unconscious and purely emotional process, no longer under the conscious intellectual control of the brainwashee. We may also call this phase the phase of auto-hypnosis. Phase 3, the reconditioning to the new order. Through both continual training and taming, the new phonograph record has to be grooved. We may compare this process with an active hypnosis into conversion. Incidental relapses to the old form of thinking have to be corrected as in phase 1. The victim is daily helped to rationalize and justify his new ideology. The inquisitor delivers to him the new arguments and reasonings. This systematic indoctrination of those who long avoided intensive indoctrination constitutes the actual political aspect of brainwashing and symbolizes the ideological Cold War going on at this very moment. Phase 4, liberation from the totalitarian spell. As soon as the brainwashee returns to a free democratic atmosphere, the hypnotic spell is broken. Temporary nervous repercussions take place, like crying spells, feelings of guilt and depression. The expectation of a hostile homeland in view of his having yielded to enemy indoctrination may fortify this reaction. The period of brainwashing becomes a nightmare. Only those who were staunch communists before may stick to it. But here, too, I have seen the enemy impose its mental pressure to well and convert their former comrades into eternal haters of the regime. And that, my friends, ends chapter 4, and it also ends part 1 of the book, The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, Menticide, and Brainwashing by Juste A.M. Merleau, M.D. See you in part 2.